All right, so we're going to have 15-minute speeches from each, and then we'll have informal discussion followed by questions. So if you've got questions, you can put them in the comments, and I'll bring them up on the screen for responses from our two guests. All right, so there, you can take it away, Josh, and I'll start the timer when you're ready.
Yeah, hit it so I can see it. Keep an eye on my time there.
Oh, hang on, I got to reset I got to change how long it's set for.
Yes, 60 seconds is a bit short. All right. So hi, my name's Josh Wulf. I'm from New Zealand. I'm 46 years old, and I was raised in a Christian family, and I've studied the Bible and Christian apologetics. I did Western philosophy and linguistics at the University of Auckland, and I was initiated into the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya of Vedanta, which is popularly known as the Hare Krishnas, in 2002, and I've been studying and practicing that for over 20 years now. So I work professionally in software engineering, and I keep up to date with scientific developments and thinking by reading journals and papers, and I've had a peer-reviewed paper published, and I presented it at an international conference, and that was about computational reasoning over semantic representations of knowledge domains, which is quite a mouthful, but it's kind of like artificial intelligence. So to our topic of discussion today, is the mind material? So in any philosophic inquiry from both the Vedic and the Western perspective, we have to start with epistemology, which is like, before we can discuss what we know, we have to look at how we know anything, or valid ways of knowing. So according to the Vedic perspective, we have pratyaksha, which is direct sense perception. That's what we would call empirical observation in Western science. And then we have anuman, which is what we'd call deduction, logical reasoning, inference. And this is kind of where we run into the first challenge in this examination, and that is that what we're trying to examine here is fundamentally the thing through which we examine. So we're talking about, is the mind material? But really, we're going to be treating this with logic and with sense perception, and these are all functions of the mind. So there's a challenge there. So there's a limitation, and in the Vedic idea, in a discussion of epistemology, some of the philosophers have said, can an eye see itself? It's a limitation of sense perception. Now, of course, you can see an eye by looking into a mirror, but that's not the same thing as directly perceiving the eye, because you're looking at a reflection of the eye. And it's just like you can't examine a microscope through itself. So we definitely can't see, hear, touch, smell, any of those physical perceptions of the mind. It exists beyond sense perception. And we can't see or touch logic either. That's like superior to sense perception as well. And it's a function of the mind itself. Now, there's a lot of things that we can't directly perceive, but we can discuss them or examine them, like gravity is an example. So we build up a picture of something like that through deduction and inference. Like even logic itself is something that's treated using logic. So when we get into a discussion about the mind, we are in somewhat of a quandary because we can't directly perceive it. So if we are going to examine it, we're going to need to do it through examining its effects and through making logical deductions and inferences about it. But it's likely that in using the instrument of logic to examine the kind of the instrument of logic itself, that we're going to run into this problem of a blind spot, in that logic, if we can't see the eye directly, can we actually examine the mind itself through logic, like that level of introspection? It may be in a blind spot. So that's the first thing that I want to acknowledge, is that there is likely to be a fundamental inability to conduct this examination all the way to the bottom just by using logic or sense perception. Now, Vedic epistemology has a third arrow in its quiver, and that is what is called shabda, or like received knowledge. And in the Western kind of tradition, we have like reference or citation to previous scientific papers or examinations. And these previous studies in the Vedic tradition are they appear slightly, but they're significantly different from scientific studies in the Western tradition, in that this received wisdom in the Vedic tradition is not simply compilations of previous kind of logical examinations or empirical studies. They're actually revelations of mystical knowledge, which is supersensory and super logic. And they have two things. They have the observations and then like a methodology for experiencing those mystical states that produce it. Now, in this kind of presentation discussion here, I'm not going to attempt to prove the validity of that. Rather, my approach is to demonstrate its usefulness in applying it to this endeavor. It's like a similarly pragmatic approach to theories about quantum mechanics or about gravity, where you can't necessarily prove the whole thing all the way to the bottom, but it's just useful as a model to use. So that's my statement about the epistemology that I'll be using. So then the next thing that I want to do is look at what is it that we mean when we say the mind, because we need to distinguish what it is that we're actually examining here. So in the Vedic tradition, there's what's called Sankhya, which is enumeration or categorization. And in Western science, we have things like the periodic table, which is a categorization of the world into elements, the atomic theory and model, and then you've got your chemical elements in there. And by having a particular enumeration, you get access to particular technologies or effects. Like you can't build an iPhone if your idea of the world is that it's earth, air, fire, water, ether. But once you get the atomic model and you get the periodic table, you can develop a technology out of that. So distinguishing what is meant by the mind, according to the Vedic Sankhya, the mind is an internal sense. It's the sixth sense, and it's the source of what Western psychological science calls qualia, the internal experience of sense perception. So you have the objects of sense perception in the field of perception, you have the senses themselves, then superior to the senses you have the mind, which is the internal experience of the sense perceptions themselves, and each of those is superior to the other categorically. So you can't the nose can't smell. It has like a experience of smell, and then within the mind, the experience of the sense perception arises. And the mind is also the repository of faculties like memory, logic, reasoning, those kind of things. So as a software developer, it's pretty clear to me that pretty much all of the internal reasoning functions of the mind can be emulated by purely material components, software and hardware, which indicates that all of those functions of the mind are in fact purely material. And according to the Vedic Sankhya, the mind itself is actually a material phenomenon. So if we're going to look for something that's non-material, we might look to sentience as a function of the mind. So now we need to look at what do we mean by sentience. So this is where we start to get into the limitations of the reasoning faculty of the mind to examine itself. So if we define sentience as the capacity to feel, perceive, or experience subjectively, then we start to run into trouble, because we're now in the realm of subjective experience. And that's definitely vulnerable to the epistemological deficiency of trying to look at the I with the I, if we're going to examine sentience with itself. But if we go to the famous Turing test, which is this idea that if you have an artificial intelligence that's sufficiently advanced, a human being conversing with that artificial intelligence can't tell whether it's another sentient being or an artificial intelligence. So we kind of axiomatically accept that the human being is sentient, and then we try to develop some kind of test for sentience based on that human being. The problem with that, though, is that it doesn't tell us anything about the internal experience of the artificial intelligence, or if it even does have an internal experience. So is there a point where we get like a sufficiently sophisticated neural network that gives rise to some kind of internal experience of subjective consciousness or qualia? Or is it just like simulation all the way down? So Richard Dawkins, in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, he argues that if you get a sufficiently advanced neurological network that's capable of modeling itself, its own operation inside its simulation of the world, that's what gives rise to like consciousness, conscious experience. That was his model for how consciousness arises out of biological living entities. So in that view, mind is kind of like a self-referential introspective neural network instantiated in a biological network in a brain, and it doesn't actually experience anything, it just thinks that it does. So the Buddhists have this kind of idea that that's what consciousness is. But according to the pure Vedic idea, there is some element which is superior to the neurological network of the brain, which can be simulated in software and hardware. And this is the experiencer of all of these things. It's the experiencer of the sense perceptions that arise from the interaction of the senses with the field of the objects and then generate some kind of sense perception within the mind. And there's internal reasoning about that. You've got a hormonal system that generates like emotions and colors, and weights, the kind of decisioning that the mind makes. But there's something that experiences all of that and is distinct from all of it. So in support of this idea, I'd like to offer one argument from quantum mechanics, and that is that, we had this famous double slit experiment that was done back in like 1801, I think, by Thomas Young, and he was trying to determine whether light was a wave or a particle. And in that experiment, what he discovered was something that really shakes the foundation of kind of modern Western empirical science to its core, and that is that the observation of a conscious living entity interferes with the experimental results, the way that the experiment actually plays out. And when we look at that, the implications of that are that, like, without going into the whole, explaining all about the quantum mechanics, it's something that you can look into, but the implications of that are that matter, time and space itself do not exist in any kind of concrete form until this probabilistic wave function, like it's a wave function of probabilities, is collapsed into a concrete reality, and that takes conscious observation to do it. So the implication of that is that even the emergence of atoms and molecules, which are the fundamental building blocks of this neural network that we experience as the human mind, requires conscious observation to arise out of the probability waveform. So that indicates that consciousness itself, the conscious observer, cannot be a product of the material components themselves, but it must in some sense precede them in order for them to even arise, to give rise to any kind of conscious experience of the material world, or even a material world to consciously experience. So it really turns out that all of these subatomic forces and particles don't have a concrete form unless they're under observation. So that creates a problem for a purely materialistic model of like consciousness in the self, because if the mind is a higher order emergent phenomenon from a self-referential neural network with an introspective capability, then where is the conscious observer that collapses the probabilistic wave into the concrete particles that actually make up that network? So it turns out from an examination of quantum mechanics that if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, not only does it not make a sound, but there's actually no tree, there's no woods, there are no atoms, and there is in fact no time or space itself. So I consider this, which is like on the very boundary of our current scientific understanding, to be the strongest evidence for the Vedic assertion that superior to the sense objects are the senses, superior to the senses is the mind, and superior to the mind is the self, or what is called in the Vedic Sankhya the Atma, and that the Atma is not material. So everything from the mind down belongs to the world of experience, but the Atma is non-material, it's what experiences, and it is what causes the collapse of the quantum probability wave into matter, time, and space. And David Deutsch, who's known as the father of quantum computing, in his book Fabric of Reality, he makes the case that the existence of virtual reality, that's the ability to completely simulate the universe within the universe, indicates that there's no basis for accepting the reality that we experience as special. And Elon Musk has kind of popularized this idea that we're living in a simulation. So on this basis, and from the behavior of matter, time, and space at the quantum level, it seems to me that an argument for the waveform collapsing entity being material is difficult to make. It suffers from the epistemological shortcomings that I began with, and I don't see how it can account for waveform collapse using something that is itself a product of waveform collapse. So the universe requires a non-waveform collapsed component to even come into existence, and it literally does exist only as the world of experience, and that requires a non-material component to generate out of the probabilistic waveform. So on that basis, I say that something that we might call mind, which is the experiencing conscious entity, is non-material.
You know, use up your last 8 seconds.
I hope I can get to travel to go to Kalachanji's in Dallas, Texas at some point in the future, in this lifetime.
Right, sorry. I have to turn that. Okay, sorry. I hadn't turned that off. Okay, so now we're going to give it over to Aaron Ra to give his opening statement.
All right, I trust you can hear me.
Yeah, your sound's coming through.
Audio. Very good. All right, given the question of whether the mind is material, we first have to determine what the mind is. I could have insisted that we agree on definitions before debating this topic, but to my experience, the definition is very often the point of contention. And I thought that this would be the case here too, that we were going to dispute what the mind is, though it seems that we may actually agree on that, at least close enough. I prepared for a number of interpretations of what is meant by material, and then what are the options for the mind to be anything other than material, perhaps magic or imaginary. I've certainly heard arguments for both of these. If Josh wants to argue instead for idealism, that nothing is real, then I think that would be a very different debate requiring a much, much longer presentation than I planned to give today, though I actually do have about 80% of a presentation on that topic, and I intend to give it later on. So we're going to have to start with the premise that reality is real, or we have literally nothing to talk about. If he wants to concede that it's a stalemate, because if I say that anything is real, if I say that this cup is real and he says that it has to have an observer, and that's the contention of his argument, then we don't have anything else to debate. We're just done. We have to start with the premise that reality is real. I've also heard arguments to the alternative to matter is energy, but physicists assure us that matter and energy are the same thing. That matter is just a slowed down form of energy, that matter can be turned into energy, and theoretically energy can be turned into matter. However, whenever someone argues for an immaterial mind, they're usually talking about a supernatural soul, a literal ghost in the machine pushing buttons and pulling levers, rather than attempt to explore the incomprehensible complexity of the haphazard configuration that we all are, which is quite different from the efficient simplicity that we should expect of divine designs of an infallible supergenius, obviously not evident in any living thing. Physicist Sean Carroll has done a few presentations to show how the soul is not even possible, and my opponent, of course, could not produce any evidence otherwise, which he should have done if he was going to win this debate. Any religious believer can only present largely irrelevant philosophical arguments, pose a curious conundrum or two, and maybe misquote some scientists out of context, but they cannot justify the unsupported assertion that there even is a supernatural in the sense that the mystics describe. And I don't see how arguing that everything is not really real achieves that goal either. We often hear that concepts are not material because they're not made of anything, but in fact they are, because concepts originate as thoughts and exist in synapses. And some of the proof of that is that we now have technology to reconstruct imagined letters from the visual cortex. And beyond that, we now have devices that can effectively read your mind to duplicate not just letters, but images to print out what is in your head. So concepts, thoughts, memories, and everything that the mind is are all material in that they're made up of and stored in material energy. They have effects on and can be affected by other physical materials. There's a lot of disagreement about what the mind is, including whether there is such a thing as a mind at all. Neurophilosopher Patricia Churchland, for example, says there is no mind, there is only the brain. I'm going to interview her next month, so I hope she'll forgive my hubris when I say that I disagree with that slightly. I think that there is some conceptual interpersonal value in distinguishing this sensation of self from the purely clinical terms of neuropathology that make us also uniquely similar. I define the mind as, I could say qualia and it would be a lot quicker, but I just wanted to summarize it as a collection of mental aspects that give us the impression of our ever-changing state of being. The collective elements that make up our dynamic personalities, including our specific knowledge and continuous thoughts, perception, attitudes, propensities, proclivities, and so on, as well as our memories and personal histories, our various types of desires, along with our integrated fear and neuroses, everything we think and feel and how we do all of that, which makes us who we are, not just as a static identity, but minute to minute, as all these things that make up our impression of mind keep adjusting to current conditions. If the mind is an illusion, as Churchland suggests, and I guess my opponent suggests also, then the mind is not material. And of course, if nothing else is either in his case, which kind of negates the whole argument. But each of these elements of what we consider a mind, you've already noticed, are individually definitely physical, meaning material. A Nobel laureate, Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the DNA double helix, wrote the astonishing hypothesis that you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And that sentiment resonated with me. There's a beauty in stripping away the vanity to realize that we are actually more complex than we ever imagined, and that all the patterns and tendencies we exhibit personally and collectively are emergent, being unwittingly directed by our most basic components, whether we look at individuals in a population, cells in a body, molecules in a cell, or so on. I agree with Churchland that what most of us would call a mind is entirely chemical and thus physical, and that this emergent impression does come mostly from the brain, but I add that other aspects of body chemistry can contribute to that too. I say this because the most basic element of the mind is consciousness, defined as an awareness of self and or perception of surroundings. You don't have to have human intelligence to have consciousness. There are numerous studies showing that other animals, and especially mammals, have consciousness as well as emotions very similar to our own, with very similar neural connectivity too. But even primitive animals with little or no brain at all obviously are able to interact with challenges in their environment, all without neurons or sensory organs. There's even a unicellular organism with no kind of brain at all, yet it demonstrates a capacity for memory and reason in laboratory tests. It's just that having more sensory systems, especially as a multicellular organism with an advanced neural network of tens of billions of interconnected neurons to better coordinate these collective senses, gives one a greater awareness and a higher level of consciousness. Now, Patricia Churchland and Daniel Dennett, the world-renowned cognitive scientist specializing in the philosophy of mind, both describe consciousness as the ebb and flow of neurons inside a healthy human brain, meaning that what we call the mind really does emanate from or is generated mostly by the brain. I've heard a number of religious believers trying to say that atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett did not believe in his own existence, as if Dennett said that the mind does not come from the brain, as if it was some mysterious otherworldly phenomenon. But that's not what Dennett said. He said that the mind doesn't come from any one part of the brain, that it is an emergent process, that it is an emergent property of the entire brain collectively, along with the supportive biochemical matrix, of course. I asked Dennett about this very debate, and he told me that as far as scientists are concerned, neuroscientists, psychologists, cognitive scientists, there is almost no, capital letters, no support for mind-body dualism. So there is no evident distinction between the mind and the physical body that makes up the mind. Religious believers often insist that neuroscientists don't understand the philosophy of mind, that they're mistaken in thinking that the mind is basically chemical. And rather than cite a neuroscientist, some have instead cited Professor of Theoretical Physics Matthew Fisher, who says that neuroscientists have basically no idea how psychiatric pharmaceuticals work because no one understands the biochemical mechanisms underlying awareness. But the fact remains that we do know exactly how certain drugs block particular receptors in the brain and what chemical reactions are taking place. To prepare for this debate, I reached out to a few neuroscientists at my school. Rick Gherkin, professor of life sciences, wrote back to me saying that he believes that the mind is a product of the brain, the body, and the physical environment, and only those things, but he didn't give me the evidence behind that. Another neuroscientist, Steve Helms-Tillery, studies how the brain learns how to use sensory information in the control of skilled motor tasks to operate not only the physical body, but also prosthetic devices. He sent me his own PDF presentation on how the mind is purely material, along with some explanation of brain functions that I thought were a bit too technical for this debate. So he wrote me a simplified explanation of how the brain builds physical connections when rehearsing pretty much anything, which is why you're good at the things you practice and may forget a lot of the stuff that you haven't had to recall in a while. He says that we know all the circuits involved in all these activities, episodic memories, and so on. I heard back from another neuroscientist, Dr. Corianne Rogalski, director of Communication Neuroimaging and Neuroscience Lab at Arizona State University. Her research interests include the neurobiology of language and music perception and how the processes interact with attention and memory in the motor system. The aim of her work is to better understand the neural and cognitive resources that are needed to improve communication and quality of life for individuals who have experienced language and cognitive impairments after a brain injury, such as a stroke, which is definitely a physical effect to the mind, meaning that the mind cannot be supernatural. And she has 2 points to back that up. One, centuries of evidence that damage to the brain can completely change the morals, beliefs, and personality traits of a person. Phineas Gage might be the most famous example, but there are numerous other examples of this. One of them being a prominent finding in neurology that tumors that grow in particular parts of the brain can lead to drastic changes, such as towards pedophilia, violence, or either to devout religiousness or a complete loss of faith, etc. Then, if the tumor is removed, these drastic changes are completely gone, or at least drastically reduced. And sometimes this happens almost immediately, or it may take a few months as the brain recovers. The same sorts of things can happen due to a stroke, brain injury, or due to a car accident, bacterial infections in the brain, etc. Her second point was that she explained the basic premise of Antonio Damasio's somatic marker idea that has been supported by numerous peer-reviewed studies, that most people assume that our minds make up an emotion, and then because our mind is dealing with this emotion, we have the physiological response. For example, if I say a police car trying to pull me over and my mind says that I should be anxious, and therefore because I label this as an anxious situation, my heart rate will increase and I'll start to sweat, etc. But this is actually not the case at all. Instead, stimuli based on associations with previous experience with them, lights, angry person, dogs coming at us, or whatever, induce unconscious brain signals that induce a physiological response of increased heart rate, etc. Then our conscious mind, sometimes because of these physiological changes in previous experiences with that situation, attaches a label to it of anxiousness, fear, happiness, or whatever. Damasio's hypothesis goes on to say that our decisions of what to do in these situations are not dependent on our mind's thoughts about what's going on, but rather that unconscious physiological response, it doesn't matter if the mind knows what's going on, that unconscious physiological response happens. Our behavior is affected, so your body's response to a situation, not your mind, dictates how you will behave. And she adds that it is true that the brain is the last frontier for medicine and science. There a lot that we still do not know about the brain and human cognition. However, if we are exponentially learning more and more as computers have become exponentially faster and more powerful, so we can begin to stimulate various networks of neurons. And prior to supercomputers, we couldn't even begin to model how a brain thinks because of its complexity. But now we're getting better and better at it. But there's still a lot that's not known, but that's how science works. Before germs were discovered, people thought that diseases were brought upon people through hexes and evil spirits. And she went on to say that a very convincing line of research is related in neural implants that can move robotic arms, which help people that have been paralyzed due to a spinal injury. Small computers implanted in the spinal cord or brain transduce neural signals into a computer code that then controls the movement of the person's arm. The scientists have quite reliably translated the firing sequence of millions of neurons into a format which the computer can then make the arm do the exact same thing that the neurons were thinking of. And there are many other neurons in the brain, roughly 85 to 86 billion, so we have a way to go, but this is progress in that direction. The last thing that she brought up was another convincing line of evidence being cochlear implants. The cochlea is technically part of the brain, situated deep inside the ear. It contains neurons that essentially transduce sound waves into neural firing. The neurons firing send the message to the rest of our brain, where the allowing us to be aware of the sound. Until fairly recently, damage to the neurons in the cochlea due to genetic mutation or injury meant that the person was deaf. But now there are many amazing and heartwarming YouTube videos of children hearing their mom for the first time because scientists and engineers have been able to design a computer, aka cochlear implant, that can be implanted in the person's ear. They can do the same thing that the neurons would have done if they were healthy. So again, we can design and build computers that work as neurons doing very complex things. And I'll close by saying that we have to acknowledge that if the brain can be altered, enhanced, and controlled by chemicals, changing your mood, mental clarity, and even your personality chemically, that kind of proves that the mind really is chemical, physically material, no matter how much the mystics want to pretend that it's a magical, immortal spirit or some other such imaginary nonsense.
Drop the mic. Boom.
Did we lose Arjuna?
We may have done.
No, I was on mute. I'm here. I didn't want my keyboard coming through. Okay, I'll cut to. They can see everybody.
Cut to commercials.
Oh, hang on. I'll get rid of
Message from our sponsor.
Get rid of the timer. All right, so now we're going to have informal discussion. Who wants to start?
You know what you should have done? You should have got Kalachandjis to sponsor this.
Yeah, for those who didn't hear the pre-recorded conversation, I live in Dallas. We have a 5-star vegetarian restaurant that's located inside a Krishna temple. And it's a favorite place for atheists when they want to visit the city of Dallas, and we'll end up, especially on a Sunday, because that's when they do their big celebration or their ceremony or whatever. There really is a very nice restaurant in there. And if you're into vegetarian food and you want ambiance, that's actually a very good setting. So I do highly recommend it. I've been to it many times, and the temple is quite nice too. So Kalachandji.
Nice. This will end up on the temple website now.
100%.
All right. Who wants to start the discussion?
Well, look, I don't know. As you began there, Aron, like there's a lot of coherence between our two positions. Like when Arjuna pitched this to me and said the mind, I said, not the mind, the self. Because I actually 100% agree, and so do the Vedic scriptures, that the mind is purely material. And as a software developer who's worked in actually like knowledge processing and artificial intelligence, it's very clear that all of the functions of that neural network of the brain can be simulated in software and hardware. So it's like purely amenable to simulation using material components. The only thing that's really kind of does an artificial intelligence have any internal kind of experience of qualia would be one thing. And does the internal experience of qualia even really exist, or do you just think that it exists? But then even more fundamentally to that is that collapse of the probability waveform in quantum mechanics into actual concrete material components is really, I think, the key area where a mind as we know it, as these, computational kind of components, only exists when you have matter and time and space. But when we get to that boundary of quantum mechanics and look at that, it's like those things don't actually exist unless there's some kind of conscious observation of them, which kind of indicates that there is some non-materially simulatable component involved in this chain of kind of perception, conscious perception.
Well, I expected that the topic of today's debate was going to be primarily focused on neurology rather than, physics, and the extreme physics at that. Although I suppose I could have predicted that because it comes up a lot. I have prepared like an hour-long presentation over this idea that none of reality is real, and some of the things that you're talking about, like that space-time. I understand that at some point when you get into the furthest reaches of what we understand to be reality, that it gets fuzzy or pixelated. And I have always expected that. I don't have a dependency on space-time. If we have a better comprehension of that, I'm all for it. But that doesn't change reality from being reality. And that's the big problem that I have. I mean, every time that this argument is used, the people who are arguing that are actually defeating their own purpose. For example, biblical literalists will often bring up that this challenge of the reality is not really real. Anytime I bring up evidence, and they can't deal with evidence, so they have to say that, that I don't know whether I'm a brain in a vat, that I can't prove that I exist. So how could I prove that this evidence against the Exodus is true? But in either case, okay, so if we imagine that reality is real, right, then we understand that the evidence is on my side and the evidence is against these biblical fables. But in this alternate reality, where the Christian apologist is arguing with me and says that reality is not real and I can't even prove that I exist, well, the Bible is still false there too.
Yes, nothing is.
So I don't even understand why they bring that up. Now, I'm completely open that the concept of space-time may not be at all what Einstein thought it was, and I understand that there's some problems with relativity. We still respect relativity. It's more accurate than Newton's original theory of gravity was. I mean, nobody doubts that gravity is real, right? It's not like Einstein disproved gravity. So when we come up with a better concept of space-time, I think we're still going to have respect for Einstein, and it's still going to be reality. Ultimately, I think that the whole thing comes down to this. And this is what really irritates me about all of the idealist arguments, is we have very complex testable explanations for how vision works, how all of our senses work. I mean, we both, I think, mentioned the ear and how these you didn't.
I mentioned the eye. You mentioned the cochlear computational implant.
Gotcha. So we were talking about the senses, and we understand how these things work, and they're very complex explanations, and we can test them. But then when you go into this idea that everything is just a virtual reality matrix, why would we have to have all of these complex explanations from a obviously deceptive God who knows damn well that's not really how it works? He just made it look like that's how it works, so that we have people that spend $100,000 going to college to get PhDs in this study of something that isn't even real. It's all an illusion. I'm sure God is laughing a great deal about that, but none of that makes any sense to me. The explanation has to be, and I realize I just said to me, so I made it about me. I made it a subjective argument, and that's fine. It's my irritation with this that we understand how these things work, and people who don't insist that no one does. And I'm okay with. I've spoken to some of the best directly, person to person, face to face. I've spoken with some of the best, cosmologists and astrophysicists in the world, and I've gotten stark admissions that, hey, nobody knows, really. But I still take it that even if the guy who knows more than me says that he doesn't know, he still knows more than me. And so I'm not going to try to usurp all of that education and expertise out of my own ignorance. I'm not going to be an example of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
To that point about virtual reality, like, we do see that there are games that you can play, like Grand Theft Auto, and you can go into a video arcade in the game and play video games inside the video game. So the whole kind of thing about that virtual reality argument, David Deutsch makes it in his book Fabric of Reality. Others have also made it as well. Elon Musk, probably most popularly known. But basically the idea is that with virtual reality simulation, since it is possible theoretically in this universe to simulate the universe itself using probably not a classical computer, because you would need to compute, more atom locations, the computational resources are actually inside the simulation. But the thing about quantum computers is, as far as we can tell, they can perform computations that require more atoms than there are in the classical universe. And David Deutsch's idea is that they actually work across parallel universes, how that actually functions at the physical level. But theoretically, it's possible to actually simulate this entire classical universe inside a quantum computer, which is what they're trying to do right now with the quantum computers they're building. They're like, there's like the way that nitrogen is produced in the soil, in the some kind of fungus or roots of some plant that grows in there that creates nitrogen at room temperature. And in order for us to make nitrogen right now as fertilizer, we have to use like massive temperatures, huge amounts of energy. If we could figure out how the roots of that plant were doing it, at this like atomic level, then we would have like room temperature nitrogen production. But in order to do that, we need this quantum computer that can simulate the movement of all of the particles inside there. So the argument with that is that since it's possible to simulate this entire universe inside some kind of computer, probably a quantum computer, it means that this universe is amenable to simulation and could be a simulation. And given that that's the case, there could be an infinite number of simulations, and which one are we likely to be in? This was, I think, Elon Musk's point, was like, given that, or maybe it was Neil deGrasse Tyson or one of those guys, like if, and then
it's so easy to get them confused, isn't it?
Yeah, they look exactly the same, right? Humans, you know, I have trouble telling them apart. They all look the same to me. But yeah, his idea was that if there's like an infinite number of virtual realities that can be simulated inside each other, if you throw a dart at like, you know, at the collection of them, what are the odds that you're going to hit the original one? So we could be inside a simulation, inside a simulation, inside a simulation somewhere. And there really is no way using the mind and the senses themselves for us to be able to tell that, because we're inside a completely bounded, consistent context with no way to see outside it. But for me, really,
I'm sorry, would you get to your point? I thought you were there. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, just really that for me, the breakdown of the whole thing happens at that wave probability collapse. But that's like a hard physics kind of thing, which you said you didn't prepare for.
Well, I didn't say that I didn't prepare for it. I said I didn't plan to give that today.
Okay.
Because I wrote a 10 to 10. I think I originally wrote a 10,000 or no, excuse me, 12,000 word presentation, and realized that I only had an hour to speak. So I had to, fortunately, because, you know, the pandemic canceled all of that, and I had to reschedule it, and I've been trying to shave bits off, you know, to where it's still a good presentation, but I cover all of the necessary points. If you want to say that there are infinite number of possibilities, infinite number of worlds, there's a number of different ways that people have presented that. I mean, the multiverse is an example of a number of different ways that that's been presented. Mm-hmm. There's lots of different concepts of that, and whether we are all in this constantly replicative simulation, are we in a simulation of a simulation? Is Brahma a simulation of a simulation? Is Brahma just a figment of a dream of some other god? But it loses interest for me in that if we can't argue, this argument only goes to negate whatever we know. And it's one of the things that irritates me most about religion is that constantly arguing that scientists don't really know what they know so that we can pretend to know what we don't know. That's what the argument for religion seems to have always been. Since they first made a clay figurine and said, wouldn't it be great if we could make this come alive? And all we need to do is breathe into it, right? And then it'll come alive. And then somebody says, hey, well, if somebody had already done that, you know, of course, extrapolate back to the next level, then maybe that's where we came from. And that, of course, was not just the beginning of the Abrahamic God, but there's a whole number of gods that began by creating clay figurines and then breathing into them the breath of life. And so there's no, if there's not a reality to reality, then there's no reality to any of these other conversations. So there's absolutely no value to it. To me.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say, and I'm sorry to be subjective, but I have to be, because I'm me. If the only value that information can have is however accurate we can show it to be, and if we can't show that it is accurate at all, then it has no value at all.
We could basically say anything then, right?
Right. So it doesn't mean anything to me because it doesn't mean anything to anybody.
Totally get it.
I think the epistemology argument is a slightly different one. I think the argument here is that consciousness is required to break down the wave function. Without an observer, you don't get the probability within the quantum realm breaking down to a fixed thing.
Exactly. You don't get any hard matter or energy or even time or space itself without some kind of conscious observer. And that double slit experiment, that blew Einstein's mind, you know, like he was dead set against quantum mechanics. He was like, no, this can't be real. But we know quantum mechanics is real because we have lots of technology that actually uses it now, like exploits it. So
and this is an important point too. I got to bring up the reason why we have a rule in science that no theory can be proven true, right? Because Einstein's relativity was technically, well, it was declared proven true twice. When in I think it was 1911, when you have this eclipse and you see the stars behind that would normally be obscured by the sun and the moon.
Yep, gravitational lensing.
Gravitational lensing. Thank you for that. I'm having these senior moments where I'm forgetting things. But then there was also just a few years ago when they confirmed gravitational waves. So we can say twice that these predictions that relativity made have been confirmed, and thus by some colloquial standards, we would say that theory has been proven true. Mm. But at the same time, we also know that there's a fundamental problem with space-time. Mm. So if you ever declared something to be true, that's it. You can't advance anymore. And it can never be wrong, even if it is. And that's another huge problem with religion.
Yeah, there is definitely something missing because we're unable to reconcile gravity and quantum mechanics. There's no quantum mechanical, like as soon as we try to make a quantum mechanical theory of gravity, it goes to infinities, which, is like nonsensical. So we must have something wrong somewhere in one of those two conceptual models, or perhaps both, or some missing element in there. But they are useful models, both of them, as far as they go at the moment. And I think that's really at the bottom of it, science itself is not about truth. It's really about like accurate or useful modeling of things. And then the more accurate and useful the model is, it unlocks more technologies. Like once we got like electricity and even the atomic model of matter, we got the periodic table, and so all kinds of things become possible from their material sciences.
I want to agree with you, but with a caveat.
Yeah.
That, okay, my definition of truth, and this may not be shared by everyone, is that the truth is what the facts are, what we can show to be true. The truth is not whatever empty assertion you want to make believe and that you really, really want to believe really hard, so you're going to say that it's the truth. Can you show the truth of it? If not, then you can't honestly say that there's any truth to it. But I understand what you're saying, that science doesn't have absolute truth. So when we try never to look at absolutes, and I can't even say that we never look at absolutes, because that would be an absolute.
And only Siths deal in absolutes.
Exactly. And when I saw that movie and he uttered that line, I'm like, you just spake an absolute.
Yeah.
And contradicted yourself. But,
it means he's a Sith, right?
Well, we had already figured out by the end of that movie that the writers were not really paying attention to what they were doing. but enough about the prequels a long time ago. We understand that in science we still teach, and this is a funny thing. I'm in this class, and there was a creationist in the class, and he doesn't like that we're studying anything about evolution, so he's arguing against this. But here we are teaching in the same class. At some point, they were teaching Dalton's model, and we know that Dalton's model is not accurate. It works for certain applications. We know that the quantum model is more accurate, but the quantum model does not work for all these other applications. Mm. So we have we have Dalton's model and we have, I can't remember the ridiculous word for it, stoichiometry. Right. We know that these have applications. There's a functionality there. So we're going to use them, even though we know that the model is wrong. We're teaching it anyway, because the model that's right doesn't work for this application, but it works for other ones. So we know that we don't have the absolute truth in any case. And that's why science progresses. There was a comedian, I can't remember his name. He's Irish, I think. And he said that, science knows that it doesn't know anything. Otherwise, it would stop.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. Nothing is ever really proven true. It's like it's just the hypothesis is strengthened rather than like we've arrived at the truth of something in science.
Wouldn't the same
Can
be
be-
true of the science's rejection of theistic claims? They're also open to being challenged.
The problem with the theistic claim is that it's not evidence-based. So, as I said, you have to show the truth of it. And if there's no truth to it, then there's no truth to it. And we're done. Science is only concerned with what is supported by evidence, and what is not supported by evidence does not warrant serious consideration. Come back when you have something to show. Until then, we have literally nothing to talk about.
But you can't make a positive claim that it's false because you never know what
We
evidence
don't
might
have to.
arise.
It's unsupported. That equals false. In the sense that they have an unsupported claim has the same credence as a claim that has already been proven wrong. Zero.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, it could be a useful source of hypotheses, right? Whereas one that's been and even things that have been proven false have later been revealed. I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but okay, go for it.
Yeah, Lamarckism.
Proven false and then came back?
Well, I must have jumped ahead. Not necessarily came back.
Yeah.
But Lamarckism actually makes sense to some degree in epigenetics.
Can you tell people what Lamarckism is?
I'm sorry, what?
Can you explain what?
Lamarck had this idea that if you work out with weights all your life, then when you have a baby, your baby will be born stronger than other babies.
Yeah, it'll inherit.
So we know that doesn't. Right, we know that doesn't work. But if you're a smoker, your baby will be impeded by your smoking.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and usually it's a limit of like no more than 7 generations, though there are exceptions where the detriment that you've caused or whatever the environmental enhancement was that you engaged in can affect your children into some number of generations.
Mm. Yeah, and so, okay, that was heritable attributes from...
acquired characteristics.
Acquired characteristics.
And
yes,
the experiment, the most famous experiment that they did was when they went. It's a horrible, horrible experiment, and I hate that science has to do shit like this. But they chopped the tails off generation after generation after generation of mice.
Okay.
To see if mice would be born with shorter tails.
Mm.
And part of the idiocy with that is that it's just as likely that natural selection could have taken it. That if mice just happened to be born with hamster-sized tails, because hamsters have little tiny tails, that was a genetic mutation. If a rat is born or a mouse is born with a genetic mutation to have a hamster-sized tail, then wouldn't the Lamarckians declare that they had proved themselves correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not control. It doesn't control for that. Yeah, and then so Lamarck's idea was kind of defeated by Mendel's experiments with the peas, right? With the breeding of the peas. I've actually been to Mendel's garden in Brno in Czech Republic. Yeah, I bought a T-shirt there. It says Mendel's pea soup.
Where is that garden?
It's in Brno, which is in the mountains in the Czech Republic.
Okay, I only went to Prague, and I love Prague. If you want to record a commercial, I'll give you
a plug for Prague. Yeah, it's awesome.
Another beautiful place that I enjoyed visiting, but I didn't get to see anywhere else in there. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was there in February, up in the mountains again, but I visited in, I think, 2012 or 11, somewhere around there. And I mean, Mendel did his experiments where he demonstrated the inheritance of these characteristics, like at a genetic kind of level through these combinations, but then he went on to do it with another type of plant that is actually asexual in its reproduction, which he didn't know about. And so, all of those kind of results of heritability from these intrinsic characteristics, like the data, the hypothesis disappeared in the experimental data, but it was because they were asexually reproducing. And so his stuff went on the back burner for a number of years, which is why he was never recognized in his own lifetime, because it was only when they went back and re-examined it that they came out. So that's kind of an example of one thing that was like proven false, but then came back again later, when they discovered that there was a missing hidden variable in there that had ruined the experimental results in the second experiment, which points to yours as well. That's that missing hidden aspect can make something look like it's false.
We're spending a long time on something we agree on.
We need more disagreement, eh? What about alien AIs then? What about aliens?
Well, I don't want to be speculative, because what is my speculative opinion worth?
Could be a fruitful source of hypotheses to investigate.
All right. Well, taken as that. I mean, and this reminds me, when the first time I was ever asked to speak publicly, I was asked to come to speak in a college. And I said, I'm an undergrad. I have no business telling a graduate class anything. And they said, well, we want you as an activist. And I'm like, oh, okay then. There needed to be that caveat of justification for doing that. I mean, people ask me all the time why we haven't heard from aliens. You know, they talk about Fermi's paradox and all of that, and I have to source back to the Drake equation, because even if we had other intelligent, let's say, races in this galaxy, probabilistically we would not have heard from them. If people who don't understand what the Drake equation is, just equate the number of years that we've had life on this planet and assume that there are an equal number of planets that have that degree of life on them. So that for the first 80% of the planets that have life on them, 80% of them are only microscopic and microbial, and that only 500 million of them have multicellular life forms, and that only out of the billions of stellar systems that we have in the Milky Way galaxy, that only say 100 or so of them have radio communication, and all of them are outside of light range, because the probability is that they are all outside of light range. That even if we got a signal from them already, that it would be so distorted with all the attenuation and everything, it would be unintelligible.
Okay. But what if aliens were on the planet and deliberately hiding their existence?
Okay, complete the what if.
Okay, so here's my assertion. If you have a look at the UN agenda and the Great Reset that's happening, when I look at that and go, what's the driving force behind this economic restructuring of the earth? It kind of seems quite confusing and difficult, but then when I add one hidden variable to it, it crystallizes into something very simple. It looks to me like the phenotypic expression of a species that doesn't live in this ecosystem and doesn't share genetic material with humans, and they're transforming the earth into an export business. That's what it looks like to me. It looks like an Amazon-style crystallization of the entire planet into an export business. And I'm like, this looks to me like hidden aliens influencing this situation.
Okay.
Which doesn't really speak to anything about consciousness. It's just a pretty far out there kind of idea.
Kind of off topic here.
Just thought I'd throw that in there. But I think that consciousness really is indicated as a non-material aspect from that collapse of the wave function, scientifically. All of the simulation of the universe, virtual reality, simulating intelligence, artificial intelligence, different life forms on this planet, other planets, all of that kind of stuff happens all within the realm of the collapse of the waveform, which only happens when there's some kind of conscious observer of whatever it is that's collapsing, this probabilistic waveform. So to me,
since that became the topic, rather than is the mind material.
Well, that's the consciousness. Conscious observer is one element of the mind. The mind is a pretty overarching term in philosophy of mind.
Nah, it's the mind itself is purely material and is
you're equivocating. That the word has multiple uses. In Western philosophy, they use the word mind to refer to everything that's not the body. It's like
so
consciousness,
both of
quality,
the debaters
observer.
agreed on what mind is, and the moderator is telling us both we're wrong.
Yeah. The mind is fully amenable to simulation. It has to be material. Because you can create artificial intelligence, it's just it's material. It can be simulated in software and hardware. It's a sufficiently complicated neural network, self-referential, introspective. The only thing that's missing from that is qualia. Like, does an artificial intelligence have any subjective internal experience, or does it just think that it does? Which leads us to the question, do we just think that we have an internal experience as well?
So since you conceded that the mind is material, then I will also concede to you that since the concept of mind, as Patricia Churchland explained, is itself an illusion, then an illusion is not material.
Oh, well, there's a big problem if you want to say it's an illusion, because an illusion is something that happens to a conscious observer. And then we've got to figure out how to explain the person or the thing which is under illusion, which is invoked when you use the word illusion.
Again, the two debaters are arguing against the moderator.
What's the illusion? When you say illusion is not material, it is kind of like you're saying what Arjuna is saying, isn't it? Like, what do you mean by an illusion is not material?
We have this impression that the very idea of mind-body dualism, where we see through our eyes and kind of visualize our eyes as being windows, as if we're sitting behind our eyes looking through them, as if we're somehow different than the body that creates all of our mental effects. And people who have had, when I mentioned that the brain produces most of the mind, but I always caution that doesn't produce all of the brain. I mean, anybody with a stomach disorder can tell you that the stomach actually controls a hell of a lot more than we give the brain credit for. So it is an illusion that we are separate from the body we inhabit, that we drive this body, and so it leads to religious ideas that we are merely operators of these biochemical machines, and that when this machine breaks down, then I will become a pedestrian, or that I will occupy a different body in another life, or that I will become an observer somehow. And none of these are supported by anything other than speculation.
Well, I'd say that, and this is the Vedic idea supported by quantum mechanics, is that the conscious living entity is the observer of the body, which includes the mind. Like that, it's basically a machine. It can be completely modeled, and you can predict. Like, if you could simulate to the sufficient level of depth the neural network that's in your head, you could create a 100% simulacrum. It would start to drift because it would get different sensory input, over time. But otherwise, there's nothing in there that's not completely simulatable, but there is something that experiences that. And that causes ultimately the collapse of the waveform into concrete reality, which is then being observed somehow, which includes the body and the mind itself. So according to the Vedic idea, we are like the observer of the body and the mind, experiencing it.
Aron was saying that your idea that the consciousness breaks down the wave function is saying that reality doesn't exist. Would you like to comment on that, Josh?
But I don't think that's what I said.
Okay, sorry. Do you want to reiterate that point? Because I don't think that point's really been properly addressed.
I think we covered that. I mean, if you can't argue that anything is material because material isn't material, then there's no point in discussing it any further.
Well, I think the problem that we have to confront there is that quantum mechanics does demonstrate that unless it's under some conscious observation, material doesn't exist. Like, it does exist, but only under observation. When it's not under observation, it doesn't have any concrete form.
Yeah, I've read that myself. And I don't have any understanding of it because it's well outside of what I do. But at what point does this change the reality of what I understand about evolution? What is it? When does it, if you're an optometrist, when does it challenge how you understand how the eye sees? When does it challenge any of our scientific understandings of anything and how they actually work? You have to get to the limits of reality before there's any impact at all, and then it disproves everything. So again, it devalues itself.
I don't think it disproves everything. You're right in that it does show up right at the boundary. It doesn't disprove anything within the boundary itself, but what it does
not to me. Not to me, it doesn't. But I've had other people argue with me.
Okay, yeah.
That
Well,
whatever I'm telling them that they don't want to accept, they can disprove that by proving that reality isn't real, and therefore evolution isn't true, and everything else isn't true either.
I don't know whether evolution is true or not, but it is definitely the most coherent and powerful explanation that we currently have to explain, what we observe, in my opinion.
And I realize I shouldn't have used the word true, but I am talking with colloquial thinking people.
No, I get what you're saying. You're saying it's the currently favored hypothesis due to its utility and its correspondence with observation. In terms of like everything, it's internally coherent, consistent, it's useful, but it's at that boundary, and that breakdown at the boundary there indicates that there is something that is not a product of time, space, or matter that is involved in the actual generation of those things. So that thing, by definition, has to be non-material, and that is involved in conscious experience, like our conscious experience. So whatever it is that's consciously experiencing your body and mind right now, the body of Aron Ra, is non-material, ultimately.
Okay.
Otherwise,
but then if we can't agree on a common reality, then there's nothing to discuss.
No,
Literally.
I mean, we can agree on a common reality. I think that we do. It's at the point of where does that common reality, where and how is it generated is the fundamental point.
Yeah, and I hate talking about things that I don't know. I mean, I'm happy to learn all the time, but I don't like to speculate. I don't want to pontificate, and as I said, my opinion, unlearned, is valueless. So I'm sure that there are physicists, and as I said, I've had the good fortune of being able to speak to some of the most prominent in the world, and some of them have even called me friend, which I'm proud to say. But I don't know what they know. I don't understand the field at all, so I'm not comfortable talking about it.
Yeah, it's kind of more of a metaphysical approach. Well, then here's something, within that realm that you might be able to find a discussion on. Jesus Christ is the only way, the only truth, and the only light. And all of the animals went 2 by 2 onto the ark, and evolution is a complete lie.
Well, it somehow sounds less believable with a Pacific accent. I don't know what is the
Kiwi.
demographic to.
Yeah.
Well, if I'm including Australia and New Zealand, I forget what the collective.
Australasia.
Australasia. Thank you. It would sound more convincing if you sounded like you came from Kentucky or Alabama. But thank you for that attempt.
Yeah, I listened to one talk you did with a young Earth creationist guy. I mean, look, that also could be true. That all the evidence is faked, and that they're covering up what really happened. It is difficult to support, but yeah, he has like a dinosaur park that he made, Dinosaur Land or something.
That guy, yeah. The guy who spent 9 years in prison for 51 counts of 3 different kinds of fraud.
Okay. Okay, that does tend to undermine his credibility a bit.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know if we're going to have a Q&A.
Yeah. So if people have questions on YouTube, they can throw them in the comments and I can pull them up on the screen and they can address them. Put question marks at the beginning so that I can spot it. But we should probably keep the discussion going while those stream in. Aaron made a few other points. I don't know if you want to, like addressing how we know the brain's causing our senses, our senses feed into the brain and we understand how that works. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting.
And qualia?
I read a book when I was younger about the function of the gut, and the hormonal system in generating conscious experience and thought. And to me, it seems like the hormonal system releases different chemicals into the body, hormones, and they kind of weight the decisioning of the neural network. It's like you've got purely logical reasoning, but then the emotional experience weights different pathways. And you gave the example of like, you know, you hear the police siren going, and because you have had some previous experience with police, it like causes an interpretation of that, which then triggers some physical response, like you start dumping adrenaline, and then, you know, that changes your interpretation of the whole thing, and then you act correlated with that, rather than purely on like a logical basis. I don't think there's anything really that I disagreed with that. That just seemed like a, you know, like a more complete understanding of how that kind of facet works.
Well, ultimately, when we're talking about the senses, we're talking about qualia.
Qualia? I don't know that we are, because, you know, according to the Vedic idea, there's the objects of the senses. There are the senses themselves. And Aron, you said before that, you know, we think that we see through the eyes and that they're like a window and that we are not the. I mean, you can take out people's eyes and they can still function, and, you know, they can even still remember, you know, call forth the memory of sight, which indicates that the function of the sense perception of sight is distinct from the actual sense organ itself. So the senses being qualia is, I don't think, supported by that. And then you have within the mind the experience of the perception of sight, which you can, I think you might have mentioned it, like they can do like MRI kind of imaging and even stimulation of different parts of the brain to generate those experiences, which indicates that either it's like a meta function of the neural network itself, that it thinks that it's having an experience of something. But I remember one experiment that they did where people would decide to move their arm, and then their arm would move, but it was almost that the arm would move first, and then in the MRI scanning, the story about I'm going to move my arm happened actually after the arm moved. So it's like the arm actually moves first, and then the interpretation that I am making my arm move happens afterwards.
I can't speak to that. I haven't read that.
And then they did another experiment where they stimulated a part of the brain which made the arm move, but the interpretation that I'm making my arm did not occur. But yeah, if you haven't seen that, and I can't quote the source of it either. Might have been in some, yeah, could have been anywhere. I'd have to Google it up again.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah. So Thomas Anderson is asking, what about dreams? How can we make sense of that?
I don't think you can make sense of dreams. And that's another sad thing, is that we've got whole books of the Bible that were written out of a dream, which people try to ascribe meaning to it. This is what happens when your brain goes on autopilot. And the only meaning that I've been able to interpret is that when I'm out of control in my life, in periods of my life when I have no agency of my own, that I'm being blown about by the wind of circumstance, my dreams tend to focus a lot on tornadoes. And when I do have control of my faculties and everything, and then things are going the way that I want them to, then I dream that I can fly and have other abilities as well. So I think that's the only correlation to reality that I've been able to ascertain for dreams. Otherwise, they're virtually meaningless. I have dreamed that I am other people than myself. I had a dream that I was an elderly Hindu in India, and I'm not in any sense me. The house I live in is not mine. You know, everybody that I recognize as my family is not my family. The hell does that mean? Why would I even have a dream like that?
That's you in your previous life, Aron. It's very clear to me.
Yeah, well, but people say you can't die in your dream, because if you die in your dream, then you die in real life. I've died in 3 or 4 of my dreams.
I have too.
Yeah.
I think one thing about dreams is that they represent like a a breakdown of the linear thinking of the normal reasoning process, and you get like a lot of lateral kind of free associations happening. Like as a coder, I have noticed, like if I stay awake coding for a couple of days at a time, like my brain will go into this fugue kind of state and will start like creating these kind of connections that, like hyper creative. And also,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just to finish that, also I noticed that it happens kind of around 2 to 3 a.m. in the morning. Whether I'm awake or asleep, my brain goes into the state where it starts like associating things together and like jumping to these like intuitive conclusions, you might say.
I have been in these situations where you work the 12-hour shift and you have to do all of this other work as well, and so you end up just like not sleeping for, I think I've gone 4 days without sleep at the limit, but it wasn't just one time that I did that kind of thing. It was one time I made it to 4 days, but it was several times I did it to 3 and a whole lot more that I did it to 2. But I remember once upon a time being at work. One of these days, shut up, dog. I apologize. Do not ever get a Great Pyrenees. They bark continuously. Anyway, I remember being a couple of days without sleep, and I'm at work and I'm trying to do, my call center support was the job that I had at the time, and I was complaining that the sun is streaming in through the window and blinding me, and I was in a warehouse that had no windows.
Okay.
And it took a bit to realize there's no sunlight stabbing me in the eye. I'm entirely hallucinating all of that.
Wow. Any other questions come in?
Yeah, I'm just resizing it. Hang on. Make it fit.
Looks like people are arguing in there.
Yeah, there's a little debate on the, like with another Hindu. So, John Pujol, what about the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson and evidence of past lives? Josh Wulf can speak to this.
I'm not familiar with the work of Ian Stevenson. Evidence of past lives.
Dr. Ian Stevenson was a researcher. I can't remember what university he was at, and he did extensive research on past lives. They'd find children. He liked to find children who were young because then nobody was prodding them to remember a past life, because obviously if you're hypnotizing someone to remember their past life, the imagination can run wild. So he'd like to find children that had spontaneously remembered past lives, and they would report, how they died and different things, and could name people from their past lives. And he'd like find a scar or like a death wound from the previous body and match it to birthmarks, and he'd grid the body so he could figure out the probability of a birthmark happening in the same spot as the death wound of the previous life. And I think there was even one kid who was able to find buried treasure. Just a little comment on that.
And that kid started the Mormon Church.
I think in my personal experience, the strongest kind of argument for that is this guy called Aron Ra, who in his previous life was a Hindu sadhu, and then in his next life became an atheist preacher and went to Kalachandji's Hare Krishna restaurant. But I think that the weakness of that kind of research is it's difficult to. There's two things. One is that it's difficult to control, but more fundamentally than that is that it violates scientific hypotheses and theories and frameworks are not simply an observation plus some kind of interpretation. Like that interpretation has to integrate with a wider body of knowledge and like reinforce its strength. The difficulty with that kind of thing is that if you take those observations and say, yes, that is valid, what you've done then, and this is why scientists are not going to be amenable to this kind of research, is it decreases the total certainty and the total knowledge of the body of science, because now you've introduced more unexplained things than you have explained something, which is why people are not going to be amenable to that as a scientific research. Even if you had controlled it, you had the whole thing, at the end of it, you end up with like an actually inexplicable phenomenon where science is just like, well, how does that happen? How can that even happen? Which would be more of an argument of why scientists would not want to consider that, even if it were true.
I am getting messages that there's something that I need to deal with quickly. So I'd like to wrap this up I don't mean to push you along, but I kind of need to.
Yeah, no,
Cut
fine.
to the next question. Sudendra D, is the idea about existence of God part of this debate? Not
I don't think
exactly.
either of us brought that up.
No, that's not directly involved. I mean, proving that there's a non-material aspect of reality as a way of rejecting physicalism or naturalism, which is one step closer to proving theism, because once you've got something non-physical, then you might have other things that are non-physical.
How long do you have, Aron?
But even if we did disprove the physical, that does not support theism.
No, yeah, not directly, for sure.
I think the strongest argument in favor of theism is that Kalachanji's is like got great ambience in food. That's probably that's the strongest argument I've heard in this discussion.
Okay. All right. So I want to close up if I can, because I am getting messages, something I need to deal with. So
okay. Do you want to give your concluding statement in that case? Final words.
I'm happy to see that we agree on a whole lot more than I thought that we would. So there's that, and this has been a much better experience than what I usually get from the Christian apologists who are just barking mad, foaming at the mouth.
Yeah, I think the real point of like departure or difference would be in like the opening for the some non-material component of the self and the experience in a human being, which shows up on the boundary of science at the quantum level. But pretty much past that point in the realm of the material, we seem to agree on pretty much everything there.
There's just like 4 or 5 more comments. Maybe we can rush through them.
I'm happy to stay on and continue to address them if you got to drop off. Now,
I do. I'm afraid I have to drop off.
Well,
yeah. Okay. Great to meet you and have this conversation with you.
Thanks for coming on.
I look forward to having dinner with you at Kalachanji's at some point in the near future.
All right. You make it to Dallas. We'll do it.
Okay.
All right.
Deal.
Thank you much. Bye-bye.
See you later.
Yeah.